in your practice, do you see a relationship between the people who get a lot of X-rays, a lot of radiation exposure, and bone health?
Well, you can certainly see that where people who have direct radiation, for example, to the breasts, and then they have some trouble with the spine or the ribs. Yeah, I haven't say that we haven't focused to look particularly at that data, but you certainly do see people that when you account for their susceptibility to fracture, you see that radiation damage. You know, Dr. Moss, it was more just, I got intrigued with it just because it's one of these things that we aren't aware of. I myself had a CAT scan for really just because the doctor thought, well, let's do it for the heck of it to see if this pain is anything. And I never realized that I could do something to help with that radiation exposure. And I wasn't really even so aware of the amount of radiation exposure. So it was more like to share with my clients. And then I thought it'd be fun to get your opinion on it to see how valid that is. I mean, these researchers in Canada have worked kind of carefully on this. And they picked a series of antioxidants, the one interesting researcher was, they actually also looked then at just vitamin C and the possibility that even if you couldn't load up with these ahead of time, vitamin C, even after exposure. But then I was talking to some clients who had to have radiation for their treatments of cancer. And I thought, gee, I wonder if this protocol would pertain. I wonder what Dr. Moss would say about that. So that's what I was thinking about. It's not that it's such a pressing issue for our clients. It's more just that little slow building of awareness about these medical treatments and what we should think twice before we get them, and then maybe take some precautions if we can.
Sometimes you can substitute an MRI for a CAT scan. It's not always possible, but sometimes it is, and you just have to ask for it. It takes more, from my personal experience, it takes more time to set up the MRI, and the MRI is more expensive, but not by that much, but it is somewhat more expensive. So hospitals usually have the CAT scan, the CT scan machine all warmed up and ready to go in emergency rooms, and the MRI, they have to send somebody down. It takes about an hour to get it going. So, but the MRI has no ionizing radiation to it.
Right.
It's entirely done by magnets, except you do get sometimes injection with a contrast agent, which has issues of its own. But so the same thing with a CAT scan. So I think what I tell my phone consultee clients and people in my, read my reports and my articles, ask for the MRI.
Yes,
and the other thing you can ask for is an ultrasound, sonography, which isn't as precise as the CAT scan or the MRI, but it still oftentimes yields enough information. And that also, it's a sound wave. It's the same thing that they use to tell the sex of a child.
Right.
So it's not very dangerous at all. I wanted to ask you one question to begin with. Why, and I'm sure there's a good scientific reason for this, but why is your site addressed to women? Don't men also have bone problems?
Right. So our site, betterbones.com, addresses women because I'm a woman, and we really speak to the women who have a very significant concern with bone health. But the real issue is that the medical system has focused on women and made a real market around women and osteoporosis. And many women are being terrorized because they're reported to have low bone density. And actually, while the hip fracture rate is decreasing in this country, you see a great escalating fear around osteoporosis and fracturing. So it's my desire to help women understand the processes by which they build bone, the many processes by which we get out of balance and lose bone. And we mainly have focused on women because that's our largest audience. But also, Dr. Moss, it's very interesting. Men are treated totally different by the medical system. In fact, I've written a few blogs on this. One of my blogs was, Doctor, Treat Me Like a Man. Because when a man comes in with osteoporosis, they do extensive studies. They look at they look at everything from the sex hormones to loss of calcium in urine to parathyroid, even to serum protein electrophoresis, which they don't do for women, even if they needlessly fracture a spine. And so there's a need to rectify that situation. When men come to me, I'm happy to work with them. We see some interesting things. Some men fall in that bailiwick of just being small bone men, and so they have low bone readings. Of course, if you've seen my site, you know we really take on this whole question of bone density. It's obviously, I always say, a good try but no cigar. You cannot predict fracture risk by bone density, and they're trying to find ways to detect bone strength, but they haven't quite got there yet. So everyone's still using this, but it's
So is
very,
that,
yeah.
excuse me, Dr. Brown, is that identical, is bone density, low bone density identical to osteopenia?
Osteoporosis is always defined by needless fracture. And then in the mid 80s, they developed, and I was at these meetings at Harvard, and they developed a machine to measure bone density. And they were so excited. They said, now we're going to be able to predict who's going to fracture. And so after 10 years of collecting data, they said, we got it. We're just going to take the people with the lowest bone density, -2 standard deviations. These are the people that are going to fracture. These are the couple million fractures we're going to see a year. We're going to call that osteoporosis. Then we're going to make another group that kind of means not quite osteoporosis, but not really the 1 standard deviation away from the average young person. We're going to call those osteopenia. It is like totally made up. And it has become a diagnosis when it never was meant to be a diagnosis. It was simply a way of dealing with statistics. And so, yes, today we define osteoporosis by bone density, which is totally invented and totally revolving around this development of bone density machines. Actually, you see a very direct correlation between body size and bone density. So the smaller bone people are going to be put into that category, whether or not they have multiple risk factors. What's pretty clear to us through our 30 years of work with bone health is that the best predictor of fracture is multiple risk factors. Bone density, and even excluding bone density, you still get a very good reading just looking at multiple risk factors. I think in Europe, it's 80%. Here, it's probably 75% of all fractures occur in people that don't have an osteoporotic bone density. They have what you would call either normal, 20% of fractures, low trauma fractures, occur in people with normal bone density. And many occur, the vast majority, in people with what we've designated as osteopenia. That's because bone density doesn't predict strength. And it actually has probably more to do with that matrix, the protein matrix of bone, that is so subject to inflammatory and antioxidant damage.
I see.
Yeah.
I know earlier in your career, you were a medical anthropologist.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether the incidence of bone fracture, let's say, it differs from country to country. That's the sort of question that a medical anthropologist would ask, right?
Right. And my first book, Better Bones, Better Body, was really dedicated to questioning, is it true what we say about osteoporosis? Does it happen to everyone as they age? Is it the same in every culture? Is it due to estrogen changes and low calcium? This is what they were believing, 30 years ago. And certainly that early anthropological work showed that there was vast differentiation, different rates of incidence of fracture, needless fracture. And these are these old studies showing that the cultures that had highest calcium intake had more fracture. And this is partly related to higher meat diets, using less vegetables, that sort of thing. And it's true, there was a very big difference. And still today, the African countries are almost immune. But certainly in Asia, you see now, when you see the westernization of diets, you see an increase in fracture incidence. So yeah, we're looking at the new data, and certainly it's encouraging that like hip fractures in the U.S. have gone down a bit. I think as there's more awareness of vitamin D is really very instrumental, and but there's still a big difference cross-culturally in fracture, even in separate communities.
So excuse me, which would be the countries at the highest rates, and which would be the ones with the lowest rates?
Well, the highest rates, of course, are found in places like the United States and in Scandinavia. It's very interesting, that whole Scandinavian situation, but they have very high rates. The US, the more developed countries have higher rates. Now, places like, I don't have the charts right in front of me, but places like Italy have lower rates, actually. Some places where still people eat kind of more traditional diets, more physically active lifestyles. I can look that up, how that recently has changed, but certainly the more developed the country, more industrialized, the more urbanized, the greater the fracture incidence.
So are we seeing, like in China, are we seeing increasing rates?
Well, China is really interesting because there's a lot of attention on it just because the magnitude of the problem. Same thing with India. So many millions of people going into older age. And so the Chinese are doing some of the most interesting research. In fact, if you look at the data, which we do every day, you see a lot of research from China. They're even researching and patented all their traditional formulas for everything. And yeah, you see an increasing rate. And what's alarming about it is that the magnitude of larger numbers of people getting older, the actual incidence, that's very tricky to measure. You may find one district that does measure it. I mean, it's a little tricky, but yeah, I think we feel pretty safe in saying that there's some actual increase in incidence as well as just the population increase. Like in the US, it's just the older population is getting larger, so that's more of a concern. There's more fractures, but it's not because the incidence is higher.
And you mentioned something that will come as a shock to, I'm sure, many of our viewers, which is that there was a correlation between calcium intake
Yep.
and increased bone fracture. How could that be? This is exactly the opposite of
Yeah.
what even school children are told.
Yes, yes. Well, it's another good try but no cigar. You look at it and you say, wow, there's a lot of calcium in bone. Must be if we take calcium, we're going to build bone. But if then as you scratch the surface, you see the body's very intelligent. The body's stored a lot of minerals in bone that are attached to these alkalizing compounds as a reserve both of minerals and alkaline buffer. The body is always thinking of survival first. And so it just turned out that the body has elegant ways to maintain calcium. And it will certainly absorb more calcium if it needs it. The long and the short of that story is, it seems pretty clear. If a person has a very low calcium intake and is low in regards to how much they're wasting, because there's different things that cause us to waste calcium. Some people need more than others. Either they absorb less or they have certain wasting habits in their lifestyle or dietary things or even medical things. Like 20% of all women with osteoporosis are losing calcium in the urine. And so that's a question you have to figure out. But if you have I think the research is maybe 600 milligrams of calcium. You find that it doesn't do any help to do any higher than that. And of course, I'm sure you also have a public interest focus, and I'm sure you understand kind of the lack of public interest concern in this research, and that dairy industry for years has promoted a lot of research on dairy, trying to prove that milk would be beneficial. And so now there's several cross-cultural studies showing that it's not really true. If you get above the minimum amount, say 600 milligrams, you're going to be fine. And more than that doesn't really solve the problem. And so it's time to set that aside because it's distracting from the fact that there's many other nutrients and many other minerals that are important to bone. There's many other lifestyle factors. pH balance is one of our favorite topics the bone is very willing to sacrifice itself to maintain pH balance or to maintain the blood calcium. And so we always say, give your body a full deck to play with. Give it everything it needs so it can provide all its functions without robbing bone. Yeah. So the calcium is, we got to move to multi-nutrients. In fact, we champion the 20 key bone nutrients. You want adequate calcium, but don't be relying on calcium to resolve your bone problem. And so many women blame themselves. They say, oh, I didn't drink my milk as a kid. This is why I have it. It's not true.
And are you advocating that people take these nutrients in the form of supplements or foods, or how should they get those nutrients?
Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all eat and assimilate and digest everything we needed from food? You are probably the thorough researcher you are. I'm sure you understand there are so many problems on this front. First place, you have all these issues of digestion that many people have. Our digestion is becoming very weakened. We have this terrific toxic burden that people have to deal with. It even blocks the calcium, magnesium, ATPA is often blocked, for example, by heavy metals and other toxins, that people can't even uptake magnesium. And they say, oh, I get a loose stool from it, I must be allergic, when really they have a blocked uptake. I mean, there's, if you, I'm just an anthropologist, but I started just looking at the body. It's totally amazing, the capacity of the body and the intricate, interwoven nature. So you'd love to get it from food. That's how we evolved, but it's very difficult. We've written several blogs on soil depletion. Our farming practices that we have lost 20, 30% of the nutrients in many of the foods over the last 50 years. So, I mean, there's a lot of things going on that make it really difficult. Plus, people don't eat the food. A recent study in New York State sponsored the study. They looked at fruit and vegetable intake. 1/3 of the population in New York State in any day does not get one fruit or one vegetable a day. So how, and that is, so I started saying, hey, fellow New Yorkers, we're in trouble. And then I realized it's the same nationally. So how do we expect people are going to get it from food? It's like, even if we had high quality food, even if we had strong digestion, we are not eating those foods. So we have to bring all these factors together. There's nothing like food factors, but to tell you the truth, Dr. Moss, what we see with bone health, if you're not building strong bones, you have a repair deficit. You are not delivering the environment and the nutrients you need to build bone. And so you can't expect, well, if I have one more piece of celery and I try to eat, more kale, that it's going to make that difference. You really need the nutrients to stimulate repair, starting right out with repair of the digestion and boosting immunity and trying to reduce some of these hypersensitive responses.
And how do you suggest that people do that? I mean, I get a lot of questions, of course, about immunity, and because that relates to the effectiveness of immune therapy,
Right.
cancer. And what do you suggest in terms of, you say boosting immunity, but how do you recommend that people do that?
Well, so number one, it's great to deal with those diet. Get those, well, you always say 2 cups of vegetables, organic vegetables. Again, 2 for lunch, 2 for dinner, 3 or 4 servings of fruit. We have worked with some really brilliant researchers on this issue of chronic low-grade metabolic acidosis. The chemistry being thrown off a little too acid because of our diet has such a strong tilt toward acid-forming foods. We've written a lot. I have a little book on it, this Acid Alkaline Food Guide, actually. And so we always tell people, first, alkalize your chemistry. First, know, take the amount of foods and the alkalizing minerals you need to get the chemistry in balance so you can produce the protein, so the enzymes are more effective, so your biochemical plant is working a little better. And I've worked with some very intelligent researchers who also are masters of building immunity, and I'd be happy to, I'm sure you know of these people, I'd be happy to talk about them. And so we have a person alkalize their chemistry. We worked with Dr. Russell Jaffe, a famous researcher. I'm sure you know Russ Jaffe. I studied with him for 30 years. He's taught me much of what I know. And we developed this concept of looking at the first morning urine as a rough approximation of the net acid load. So we have people measure the first morning urine, and you can very quickly tell if you're deficient in minerals. And you start to mineralize the people using, of course, minerals in alkalizing form, because how the pH is important is the mineral is always attached to another item, and if it is attached to an anion that is actually alkalizing, like a carbonate, a citrate, a ascorbate, that will alkalize the chemistry as you deliver the mineral. So we always say people alkalize first. Start right out with this alkaline diet. There's lots of information on this diet on our website, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables. We even have charts of which foods are more highly alkalized, which foods are less. So we get the diet going as best you can. Then we're very fond of a certain few key antioxidants. And I personally believe, and I've seen over 30 years of practice, that ascorbate is the number one repair nutrient in the body. It's the second most prevalent nutrient in every single living cell after magnesium, and it is the greatest repair agent. It is, in our words, the maternal sacrificial antioxidant. It will sacrifice itself even to regenerate glutathione, even to regenerate vitamin E. It is the powerhouse that provides for protective oxidative damage. So I know you've written some on the new research in vitamin C in cancer, the IVC. We, of course, use oral vitamin C, and it can be delivered in very high dose if a person uses a particularly carefully prepared buffered ascorbate. And that's what we do.
Do you have your own line of supplements, or do you recommend a particular brand? Or
We have been able to work with some of the finest researchers to develop a product called Alkaline C. I think it's around here someplace, right here. And this product is a fully buffered ascorbate, but it's buffered in such a way that you can take high dose. That's the problem. You might go out and say, well, I can buy a buffered ascorbate, but the problem is, we buffer ascorbate. Well, we like ascorbate because that is the metabolite of vitamin C that's used in the body, as opposed to ascorbic acid, which is sort of found in the plants, which is great. But ascorbic acid, the body uses as ascorbate, and you cannot take high doses of ascorbic acid because it's very acid forming. It's not pleasant to the stomach.
Yeah.
Plus, what is our higher goal is to alkalize. We want to deliver the minerals, and we want to be able to buffer. And ascorbate will buffer just like a carbonate, like a citrate. It's really a great buffering agent to reduce free hydrogen. So we have worked with some great experts and be able to take advantage of this product that will provide ascorbate with a small amount of minerals, a little calcium, a little magnesium, a little potassium. So it's buffered nicely. It adds those minerals, but the real thing is you can get high level ascorbate to the body without distressing. And you've probably heard of these really Cathcart and these others. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you look at the history of vitamin C. I mean, it's the best natural antiviral. They were able to cure polio. It's amazing how it has got set aside. And so we're back to trying to bring vitamin C to the public. This is a very excellent form of buffered vitamin C that many people who are ill, and I myself for decades, use to bowel tolerance. And you can actually challenge yourself with a vitamin C protocol. You can find out what your level is, and you can keep a steady flow of that great electron donor coming your way.
one of the things I was shocked to learn was that certain drugs that are used in cancer, like cyclophosphamide or Cytoxan,
Right.
and methotrexate, and some of the old alkylating agents are actually a cause of osteoporosis. They can really damage the bones. And I'm wondering if you've had any experience dealing with cancer patients, how you advise them, and what kind of reaction have you seen from the medical community to your recommendations, which are scientifically based, in terms of preserving bone health?
Well, first place, Dr. Moss, when I have a cancer patient who's really motivated to take charge, I send them to you, because it's cancer. You have spent your whole life doing it, and one could spend 10 lifetimes trying to see how the body builds its resistance and keeps its strength. But our program, it's called Better Bones, Better Body. And I started like 30, 40 years ago with the concept that everything we do for bones should be good for the entire body. And so we have a very strong diet program with this alkalizing, getting as much of the nutrients and pH balance as we can through food. Then we have a strong component of supplements, because we find you cannot repair without proper supplements. And we go to great lengths to deal with some of the really experts. Like this vitamin C is prepared under nitrogen so that it isn't already oxidized when you get it. We take very special care to get the highest quality products so that you can actually deliver these nutrients. So you deliver the nutrients, you get the diet, exercise, terrifically important. And I bet you've seen it. There's hardly a disorder, whether it's depression or irritable bowel, that doesn't respond as well to exercise as any drug therapy. And so we have a very strong exercise component. We've had people building like 20% of hip bone mass, just doing very clear strength training, loading of the bone.
So again, you add weights for people?
Oh, yes, because you have to load the bones in an unusual way. The body adjusts to whatever you do, right? And so you really, where you see, well, we could talk about where you see outstanding bone building is when you load the bones with unusual weights, like maybe even a few times the body weight. Actually, 4 multiples of body weight really build bone well, but you don't want to. It's actually the bending of bone that sends a signal to build bone, and muscles pulling on bone bend it. If I jump up, I bend bone, but you don't want to break the. You have to get that delicate thing where strength training is important. I guess to say, in a shortcut, you build muscle, you'll build bone. so we have a big exercise component. Then we have a big component, digestion. If you do not deal with digestion, you're not going to be able to assimilate those nutrients. And it's surprising, it's not surprising. I see over and over again, these people with low bone mass often have digestive problems. And then, the most fun frontier of our work is stress. We've totally, for decades, I've called osteoporosis this thin, worried woman syndrome, because many of my clients fall into that category. Mm-hmm. And I've discovered something really fascinating, Dr. Moss, about that is that these women generally are not breaking down a lot of bone. These women are breaking down. Nobody's bothered to measure their bone breakdown. You give them a drug to halt bone breakdown. No one bothers to see, do they have high bone breakdown? These women do not have high bone breakdown. They have low bone breakdown, but they're still losing bone. How is that? Their breakdown is low, their buildup is lower. They have an osteoblast dysfunction. And so what we're looking, and this seems to go back, the big time researchers at NIH and this are saying this probably goes back to oxidative damage to the mitochondria. So we're really interested in antioxidants on many levels, and it is a very fascinating area. So we have discovered this really widespread nature of low turnover osteoporosis, which I'm trying to think of how to educate women about. So we do the digestion, we do the exercise, we do the diet, and we do stress. And I'm going to just talk about stress for a second, and then I'm going to tell you how modern medicine responds. Modern medicine does not have time to do this. No doctor has got time to sit down and really find out what's going on with their client. It's impossible. I think we're coming to the day where if someone is really interested, they're going to have to get individual people who know their problem, help them, because medicine is way too difficult of a business, and they're not going to be able to give care to the client. And so it's just outliers like myself who got really fascinated with this. I got totally fascinated with the miraculous nature of the human body. And then how can I help myself and other women just like myself? So the issue of assessment, you have to assess the case very carefully. What doctor's got time to spend 2 hours assessing? And you got to find out what's going on. What are the causes of bone loss? What's the total load? And then try to nurture people into doing each one of these steps. But the most fascinating step is stress. So for decades, I've been saying, I see worry as a really big component to this whole problem. And then I would say I would think in simplistic terms, I'd say, wow, the body, to my mind, is spending, when I discovered low turnover osteoporosis, where osteoblast dysfunction, I said the body is deciding to spend its energy on something else and not building bone. And that something else is dealing with the stress response. And so then it seemed like pretty good sense. Then I started seeing research on cortisol, saying all the many ways that cortisol damages bone. And the fact that just a person living an average life can produce enough cortisol endogenously to damage bone. I said, wow, well, this is it. It's the whole stress response, the cortical cascade. Now, these researchers at Columbia University, Karsensky, who's been 20 years working with osteocalcin, this one bone protein that is the protein that produces the bone matrix, the collagen, they found that he's done fascinating studies to show the many roles that this osteocalcin plays in the body, from blood sugar control to how we use energy to how we respond. The latest one is how we respond to stress. I don't know if you saw this research, kind of fascinating research. They find that osteocalcin under fear, and it basically, we talk about stress, but it's really fear. It's like, and it's subconscious. We might think, well, it's fear. A fear response causes the body to then take osteocalcin out of its little job of producing protein matrix and send it into the blood. And through a kind of transformation, that osteocalcin then shuts off the parasympathetic nervous system. So it lets the sympathetic nervous system run free rein. Like if the adrenals failed you, if you couldn't respond to stress, that tiger's on your tail, you respond to that, then next thing you know, your snakes are eating you up, then it's like a backup, and it's not even a backup, it works in tandem with the adrenal system. So we're sacrificing bone for the stress response. I'll be writing a blog on that soon, and if anyone wants to hear my my thoughts on bone health, I write a blog every week at betterbones.com. And yeah, that's the stress is the most fascinating thing. And people really resonate with it. And the
Yes.
most comical thing is what? Our medical system, the way we treat bone health causes more fear. So fear is the big cause of it. Then we have a fearful approach to it.
And so much of the news, it seems almost designed to stimulate that fear reaction because that engages people. I find myself sometimes even, I hate to admit it, but in the middle of the night, I'm checking my phone. And of course, I'll check my emails, but then I'll be going into, I have subscribed to 3 newspapers, and I'll be
Yes.
going through one after the other. And what am I looking at? I'm looking at the top headline to
Yeah.
see whether the world was destroyed while I was sleeping. So yeah, I shouldn't admit
It's
this, but this is
and
this is
it's true.
how we all.
No, and it's. I mean, talk about admissions. I mean, I got into this. I was an anthropologist. I was happy doing my research around the world, but then I realized my own. Got in. I met very smart people who started teaching me about Chinese medicine, holistic medicine, nutrition. I decided, look, I'm gonna focus on this because I want to improve my own health still. So all of us are trying to deal with this environment, which is it's very difficult. It's easy to understand why we'd all be stressed out, much less that we have also a problem. Somebody tells you you're going to fracture, and be in a wheelchair. It's like, yeah, that's right.
Overload. And then the so-called diagnosis of osteopenia, every woman I know above a certain age seems to be afflicted with this. Nobody ever seems to go in my experience, and the doctor comes out and says, "Your bones are just great. Just keep on doing what you do." It's always, well, you're a little bit marginal here.
Yeah, yeah,
Or
yeah,
maybe take a Tums every day. Take a few
yeah, yeah,
Tums,
yeah.
like and you're getting all the sugar from the Tums. That can't be very good for you.
Oh,
Might
and other ingredients. The osteopenia thing, it was totally made up. I mean, it was totally made up, and it's really never should be considered a diagnosis, and the word should not even be used, really.
yeah.
50% of more than half the women will have either the bone density. I mean, if I was kind, I'd say it was a good try. It was a good try. They thought if we know the density, we can tell it's going to fracture, but it didn't happen. So we got to let go of those concepts of this osteopenia. Now, what is concerned if a person, we know, for example, the rates that the average person loses bone. We know during menopause, the average woman loses 10% of her bone mass from the first year before to the first 5 years after. We know some women lose 20%. We know we can prepare that before menopause. If you were smart enough, you start preparing and monitor that. We can easily tell the rates of bone turnover. You monitor that. You do everything you can to control that. Then afterwards you want the problem is the people that keep losing. So you want to be monitoring to see I think bone turnover markers are much more fruitful than the bone density test, actually,
Yeah.
to be able
So
to monitor that and see.
So the website is betterbones.com, is that right?
Betterbones.com. Yeah.
Do you do personal consultations for women or men who have?
Yes.
Do you do that? I
Yes,
know
I certainly do. That's
uh,
I do a few days a week. I consult with people,
by
and
telephone. By telephone,
yeah, by Skype, and some
they
people
don't.
come.
They don't have to come to Syracuse, New York, to see you.
Not. I talk to people all over the world, and it's such a privilege because you see people's stories. And I've had clients I've worked with for 20 years, and people generally follow up. We try to make sure they get on target. Why? Because they're building not only better bones, but they're really improving all their health. And this is where the immunity comes in.
Yeah.
Ha, the immune system is your circulating intelligence. You gotta try to keep that in really good shape. And
Yeah. Well, I'm
then we,
sure this will. Excuse me. I'm sure this will be of great interest to our viewers because this comes up all the time in so many ways, the question of bone health, and there are so few people who can address this and not looking just for just another drug
right.
solution, but a more natural solution. So thank you so much. It's been very enlightening. Pleasure meeting you, and I hope we'll stay in touch now.
I hope we will because my cancer clients are coming your way.
Okay, very good. Nice talking to you.
See you later. Bye
Okay,
bye.
see you again. Bye.